To try and picture this for a second, think of a really remote tropical island, lush, teeming with wildlife you wouldn't see anywhere else, maybe ancient rainforests. Just that classic image.
Right. Okay.
Okay, now, take that same island in your mind and just flip it. Imagine it suddenly becoming this huge, sprawling city. Skyscrapers, a massive, busy port buzzing with ships.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a shift.
Exactly. And that dramatic contrast you see is really the core of what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
India's Great Nicobar mega project.
It is a really stark dichotomy, isn't it? It grabs you immediately because on one hand, like you said, you've got this, frankly, enormous $9 billion plan to essentially transform this pretty untouched island into a global trade hub.
Billion, yeah.
But then the other side of that coin, this huge ambition could come at a devastating cost to the Shompen people. They're an indigenous tribe, highly isolated, and their history on that specific island might stretch back maybe 60,000 years.
60,000 years. I mean, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around that kind of time scale, isn't it?
It truly is. And the sheer scale of what's being proposed, it's kind of breathtaking.
It really is. We're talking, first off, about a transshipment port. Basically, a giant hub for moving containers between ships capable of handling something like 16 million containers a year.
16 million, that's an immense volume of trade.
Immense. And that's just part of it. They're also planning an international airport that suggests, maybe mass tourism is on the cards too.
Right, not just cargo.
And you need power for all that, so a massive power plant. But the bit that really jumps out, they want to build a whole new city designed for 650,000 people.
Wait, 650,000 on Great Nicobar?
Yeah, get this. The current population of the whole island is only about 8,000 people.
That's an increase of what? 8,000%. That's staggering.
It's almost unbelievable. And then throw in a defense base and a plan to attract 1 million tourists a year. It feels like trying to cram a century of urban development onto this one spot almost overnight.
It really does paint that picture of just radical, rapid transformation. And it's so important to remember the context here. Great Nicobar isn't, just empty land. It's recognized globally as a biodiversity hotspot.
Right. It's not huge, is it? About 900 square kilometers?
Exactly. Relatively small, but packed with life. Hundreds of plant species, many unique, over 300 animal species, plus vibrant coral reefs all around it.
And living amongst all that richness.
Are the current 8,000 residents, including, crucially, the Shompen.
The Shompen, yeah. The indigenous people, the ones who've potentially been there for those 60,000 years. Just think about that depth of connection, the knowledge of that place.
It's profound.
And their life is completely woven into that rainforest, isn't it? Sort of semi-nomadic, hunter-gatherers.
That's right. They rely on the forest for, everything. Food, like pandanus fruit, is a key staple. They hunt pigs, monitor lizards, even crocodiles sometimes. They have small gardens, too.
And I read something fascinating about the white tup tree. They use it for all sorts of things.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example of their intricate knowledge. They use it for incense, insect repellent, even apparently as a kind of chewing gum. It shows just how self-sufficient and deeply knowledgeable they are about their specific environment.
A whole different world, really.
And their isolation is such a critical factor here because they've had so little contact with the outside world, a bit like the Senanati's people on another Andaman island.
Ah, right. I've heard about them. Very isolated, too.
Exactly. So the Shompens haven't built up immunity to common diseases. Things like the flu, measles, things we might just brush off could be absolutely catastrophic for them.
So any large influx of people, like construction workers, settlers.
It carries huge risks. Health risks, cultural risks,
Yeah.
risks to their very survival as a people. It's an incredibly delicate situation.
So, okay, putting it all together, you've got this gigantic development project landing on an ecological treasure island, which is also the ancestral home of this incredibly vulnerable, isolated community with this unimaginably long history there.
It really is a collision course, isn't it? Two completely different worlds meeting, and the potential fallout for the Shompen is, it's deeply worrying. That's why there's so much international concern.
Let's talk about those impacts more directly. The deforestation needed. It sounds massive.
It is. The proposal involves clearing around 130 square kilometers of forest. That's estimated to be something like 850,000 trees.
850,000.
And remember, this isn't just any forest, it's their habitat. It's where they get their food, their materials, it's tied to their culture, their spirituality, everything. Destroying that habitat is a direct threat to their way of life.
And it's not just the trees, right? There's the river, too, Galathea River.
Yes, exactly. The construction of the port, planned for Galathea Bay, is projected to cut the river's flow by up to 90%.
90%. Wow. And that's not just water for the Shompen.
No, it's also a vital nesting site for endangered leatherback turtles. So you have this potential double whammy impacting the indigenous people and a critically endangered species simultaneously.
It's hard to see how that fits with, environmental protection.
Precisely. And then add in the people factor, bringing in potentially 650,000 settlers. Think about the pressure on resources, the inevitable encroachment into Shompen areas, even if they aren't officially displaced.
The sheer numbers are overwhelming.
They are. And this led a group of genocide scholars, about 39 of them, to issue an open letter back in February 2024.
I saw that. They used some incredibly strong language, didn't they?
They really did. They called the project potentially a death sentence for the Shompen, and even said it could be tantamount to the international crime of genocide, coming from experts like Dr. Mark Levine, Professor Raz Segal. These aren't words used lightly.
So just to be clear, they're not necessarily saying like direct violence.
Not necessarily in the conventional sense, no. Their argument, as I understand it, is more about the conditions the project creates, the destruction of their environment, the massive risk of disease wiping them out because they have no immunity, the sheer cultural disruption. It all adds up to making their continued existence practically impossible.
Right. It's about creating conditions that are unlivable for them. They used a phrase, collective psychic breakdown.
Yes, that was in the letter, describing the potential collapse of their society, their identity, under such immense, rapid pressure. It's a truly chilling prospect.
And Survival International, the group that advocates for tribal peoples, they weighed in too.
They did. They put out a report in April 2024 called Crushed. The title itself tells you a lot.
Crush, yeah.
Their view is pretty clear. They see it as prioritizing profit and strategic goals over people's lives and rights. They basically said the Shompen simply won't survive this kind of transformation.
And they're pushing for proper consultation,
Yeah.
right? Free, prior, and informed consent.
Absolutely, FPIC. They argue the Shompen haven't given this consent, which is a key principle in international law regarding indigenous peoples. They've appealed to the UN on this.
And they also point out there are already laws in India meant to protect the Shompen, like a regulation from 1956 and a specific Shompen policy from 2015.
Exactly. They're highlighting what seems like a direct conflict between these existing protections and the government's current push for the project. It raises serious questions about whether those legal safeguards are actually being upheld.
Okay, so that's the critical perspective. What's the Indian government's rationale? Why push so hard for this?
Well, the government frames it primarily in terms of national security and economic growth, positioning India as a major player in global trade, especially near the Malacca Strait, which is a critical shipping lane.
Right, strategic location.
And of course, job creation is mentioned, fitting into a broader narrative of national development and self-reliance. They also consistently state that a large part of the island, 82%, will remain protected.
82% protected.
Okay.
And they mention funds for tribal welfare.
Yeah.
And say the Shompen won't be moved.
Yes, there's a budget allocated for tribal welfare, and the official line is that there will be no physical displacement of the Shompen.
That's the official narrative.
That's the narrative, but interestingly, you have to look at the government's own environmental impact assessment for the project.
What does it say?
Well, it actually acknowledges that the project poses serious threats to the Shompen's existence, specifically citing the environmental disruption and the high risk of diseases being introduced.
So their own report flags the danger.
It does. And it even proposes things like geofencing cum surveillance towers to essentially monitor the Shompen, which, as you can imagine, raises a whole host of ethical questions about autonomy and respect.
Geofencing. Like putting a digital fence around them while their world is changed outside it?
Yeah.
That sounds deeply unsettling.
It does feel very paternalistic, doesn't it? And this idea of no physical displacement seems to ignore the fact that if you destroy the environment they depend on, you're effectively displacing their way of life, even if they don't physically move houses.
That's a really crucial point. Displacement isn't just about moving people. And others have raised concerns too, right? I remember seeing Jerome Ramesh, an MP, talking about it.
Yes, he's been quite vocal, raising concerns not just about the Shompen and the deforestation over 13,000 hectares, I believe, but also about building such massive infrastructure in an earthquake-prone zone. Remember the 2004 tsunami hit that region hard?
Right, the seismic risk. And wasn't there some legal back and forth with the National Green Tribunal?
There was. The NGT, which is India's main environmental court, actually put a temporary stop to the project initially. They had serious issues with the environmental impact assessment, felt it wasn't thorough enough.
Okay, so they did pause it.
They did, but that stay was later lifted, allowing the project to proceed, though criticisms about the assessment process and the committee that gave the final clearance have continued.
So it's moved forward, but with these lingering questions about the process.
Exactly. The initial pause shows there were significant environmental red flags raised early on by a key body.
And beyond the Shompen, the wider environmental cost. We touched on the biodiversity. Endemic species.
Huge concern there. We're talking about species found nowhere else on Earth. 11 mammals, 32 birds, just for starters. Then there's the destruction of those leatherback turtle nesting sites on Galathea Beach, a globally important site, and the damage to the coral reefs. Some estimates mentioned thousands of corals being impacted.
It sounds potentially devastating ecologically. Some people using the term ecocide.
Yes, that term has been used. It reflects the scale of potential irreversible damage to this unique ecosystem. And it stands in really stark contrast to the project's own vision document, which claims the development will be holistic and green.
Holistic and green.
Mm.
It's hard to square that with, well, everything we've just discussed.
It is. It really forces you to question what those words actually mean in practice when the predicted impacts seem so severe.
Which brings us back to that fundamental ethical dilemma, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can economic development or strategic advantage ever really justify potentially wiping out an entire unique human culture with such an ancient connection to that land?
That's the crux of it.
I remember reading a quote from Trilanath Pandit, who studied the Shompen for years. He said something like, "Their knowledge of the forests is supreme. They are happy. Let them remain the way they are." It's so simple, but
It really cuts through, doesn't it? You have this community with invaluable traditional knowledge, a sustainable way of life perfected over millennia. Is replacing that with concrete and container ships truly progress if it means their extinction?
and the irony is just, it's almost absurd. Building this giant city for outsiders on the land of people who need isolation to survive, the whole geofencing idea.
It feels quite dystopian when you think about it.
Yeah. And imagining tourists flocking there in the future. Maybe to see the megaport that replaced a pristine ecosystem while the original inhabitants are fenced off. It just feels wrong on a very basic level.
It raises profound questions about our values, definitely. What do we prioritize? And what are we willing to lose? Because as things stand, the project is moving forward, despite all the opposition, despite the warnings.
So for anyone listening, this ongoing situation on Great Nicobar really forces us, I think, to reflect on what we mean by progress. Is it just about bigger ports and more trade? Or does it have to include protecting biodiversity, unique cultures, respecting indigenous rights?
That's the critical question.
Because the choices being made there, they aren't just about that one island. They say something about the kind of future we're building everywhere. What's ultimately more valuable, another global trade hub, or the survival of the Shompen and the unique world they inhabit. It's a heavy question, and the answer will have consequences that last for a very, very long time.